Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week we're just going to look at a couple of paintings by three different artists. So about 6 paintings in total. Each painting I'm just going to point out a couple of little things about them, things that are interesting or maybe useful. The first artist is this guy Camille Pissarro. He was one of the original Impressionists, took part in many, if not all, of the Impressionist exhibitions. He, like all the other Impressionists, he worked mostly in oil paint, but he did do a few watercolors. Now, some of them may just have been value studies or color studies, little sketches and things, but he did use watercolor from time to time. On the right, you can see an example of one of his watercolors, this little Parisian street scene. Couple of things I wanted to point out here. One is it's very loose style, so it's not fussy, although there's a lot going on. He's sort of suggesting details rather than actually painting in all of the details. If you look at a lot of the horses and carts and people, there really isn't that much detail there. We can't really see faces and things like that, but he's suggesting these things, and that's the first point. You don't have to put in every detail. You can suggest things and the viewer will sort of fill in the blanks and use their imagination a bit. I think it's a useful trick to remember. Whether you're doing landscapes, urban sort of street scenes, whatever it is. The other thing I want to point out was he creates a feeling of depth in this little painting by using aerial perspective. Some people call it atmospheric perspective. So if you look at the more distant buildings, the buildings near the center of the painting, they're less distinct. There are fewer details. The value range is reduced. So you get the lighter values, but you don't get the darker values. And you can compare those buildings to the near building on the left of the painting, where you can see the individual windows and some structure and the architecture and things. And you can see darker values. The other thing is the more distant buildings, the ones near the center, he's also used cooler colors, bluer colors. Sometimes people say this, that sort of warm colors move forwards and the cooler colors recede, they go backwards. I don't know if that's a rule. I wouldn't say that's a rule or anything, but some people use it as a way of suggesting depth. So atmospheric or aerial perspective, something else, especially in landscapes. You have a bit of distance, a bit of depth. It's one alternative. And of course you can combine it with linear perspective as well. Another one of Pissarro's watercolor paintings. Some boats in a marina or a harbor. I just wanted to point out with this one is, for example, the sky and those green trees, he's only suggesting them with a few loose brush marks and a few lines. There may be some pencil work in this as well. So again, it's this idea of loose watercolor painting. You don't have to paint in all the leaves on the trees or anything. You can just sort of suggest that there's trees. And we understand, I think, most of us will understand that it's trees. Those green things are trees. But he's just got a few loose brush strokes, really. And this is really, his years doing Impressionism would have helped his ability to suggest things with just a few simple brush marks. Other things, there's a bit of line work as well, where he's suggesting shapes just with lines rather than colors or blocks of color. So the distant buildings on the left-hand side, sort of harbor wall, it's all just done with darker outlines. The boats as well, they're sort of, a lot of the shape is defined by some darker shapes and darker lines. In my landscape watercolor paintings, I don't really use lines that much, apart from a horizon line and some field boundaries. But those lines, you don't have to put that many in. They can help to give some structure to your painting. They can define shapes that the viewer can then interpret. And that's part of what a painting is, I guess, is we're making marks, abstract, flat, two-dimensional marks, and the viewer comes along, looks at it, and interprets it as a three-dimensional landscape or seascape or whatever it is. So next artist is this guy, Cézanne. I have a sort of love-hate relationship with his art. It is very interesting. Some of it is not my favorite, but his watercolors in particular are very interesting. So this little landscape on the right, I think it's called something like forest path or something like that. So a little path through some wooded area. He has this way of breaking things up into these sort of flat geometric shapes. And he did the same with oil painting as well sometimes. And it's sort of his trademark way of painting. So it's very different from, say, Pissarro and the other Impressionists. Cézanne was not a fan of Impressionism, even though he did take part in the first Impressionist exhibition. He wasn't a fan of that style of painting. The only other Impressionist artist that he really did stay friendly with right through was Camille Pissarro. Pissarro was a very likable person, it seems. He was friendly with a lot of artists, including artists who were much younger than him, artists who were older. He just seemed to be able to, the kind of person who could get along with anybody, really. Quite opposite from Cézanne, who was didn't have many friends and was more of a recluse and quite a difficult person to get to know, I think. But his style of painting is this sort of building up these little shapes, these two-dimensional shapes, defined by color and also darker outlines in places. It's a very interesting way of using watercolor. Another one of Cézanne's paintings, some trees in front of some buildings. Again, it can be difficult to see what's going on sometimes with Cézanne's paintings, I think. So the trees, they're all sort of interesting shapes, and there are buildings, but the buildings in the background are not immediately obvious. But again, he's going for those sort of patches of colours as well, and sort of geometric shapes. Last one is this guy, John Singer Sargent, and he did a lot of watercolor as well as oil paintings. An example of one of his little watercolors on the right. This one's interesting because he has the foreground in shadow, and he's using darker values and blues as well to suggest this shadow. But it's in the foreground, and then the background is the warmer reds and oranges and things. So this is kind of the opposite of, you remember at the beginning I was talking about aerial perspective, and people say the warm colors move forward and the cool colors move backwards. Well, Sargent here has done the opposite. So I'll say these things are not rules. They're ideas that you can accept or deny or use or ignore, but I wouldn't treat them as rules. So it is interesting. It's just of the blues and things suggest the cooler shadow and shade in the foreground, and then the warmer reds and oranges and things in the background. One last painting, again this one's by Sargent. He was a real master, in my opinion, of loose watercolor landscape painting. So his loose marks are very simple in some ways, but incredibly confident and very effective at suggesting things. So, for example, the rooks, sort of in the foreground there. If you look at some of the shadows, he's just using single brush marks and things to suggest shadows and shapes and make the rocks stand out from each other. But the way he's doing it is very, very skillfully, even though it's very loosely done. And that, to me, that's sort of the goal. Painting in a loose way, if you can do it, but get to the point where you're as accurate and as confident as John Singer Sargent was. So that's the sort of goal that I would set myself. Now, I might never get there, but it's a goal to aim for. Also, the brush marks that he's used to create the feeling of the water, the stream running between these rocks, again, is very impressive. We can almost imagine the sound of the water gurgling in the stream as it's coming down the hill. Also, his use of wet and wet, some areas quite soft edges, and then there's other quite hard edges in there as well. I think anybody who's interested in watercolor landscape painting, this little painting and other paintings by Sargent are worth studying. You can learn a lot, or at least you can see a lot of things in there, and you can aim for trying to reproduce this style of painting. Anyway, those are just some ideas. 3 very interesting artists, 3 very skillful artists, and their watercolors in particular I'm a big fan of. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and listening, and hopefully see you again in next week's video.